Hi, everyone, and welcome to the event. I want to thank everyone here in person, as well as those of you around the world who have created some time in your schedule to come out and hear this talk. My name is Jason Webb. I'm a USC faculty member. I work in the Department of Comparative Literature, and I also serve as the Associate Director for the Shinsō Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. So it's my great pleasure today to convene the latest installment in the Center Environmental Humanities Speaker Series. We are thrilled at the Center to be able to welcome Professor Eike Rotz of the University of Oslo. He's very well known in the field, so I think he probably requires a little introduction from me. He has distinguished himself by way of his innovative and critical approaches to a range of issues involving religious practice and environmental concerns. I would like to make note of his first monograph entitled Shinto, Nature, and Ideology in Contemporary Japan, Making Sacred Forests. This was published in 2017. Currently, his research is under the auspices of the ERC-funded project entitled Whales of Power, Aquatic Mammals, Devotional Practices, and Environmental Change in Maritime East Asia. And his talk today, if I understand correctly, is going to be a small portion of that project. So two quick announcements before I turn things over to Professor Rotz. We will have a Q&A session following the lecture in which, of course, people here in the room with us, but also folks who are accessing the event online around the world will be able to pose questions and make comments to the speaker. Those of you who are in Zoom land, if you could kindly not use the chat bar, but rather use the Q&A tab at the bottom. There's a special spot for you to pose your questions, and I'll do my best to collate them in a coherent way, during the talk and after. Last, I want to make note that this event is part of the International Education Week, which is a joint project between the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Education, meant to celebrate international exchange and international education. So without further ado, if you could please join me in giving Professor Rotz, who's come all the way from Oslo, a warm Trojan welcome.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that very kind introduction. Many thanks to the Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture for inviting me, for organizing this. Many thanks to all of you for coming, for joining today, and also those of you who join on Zoom. Look forward to the Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to start with some stories, with some places I'm going to introduce you to. Some of you may have been to Japan, others not, but these are places in different parts of the Japanese archipelago. I'm going to start in a town called Usuki, which is in the prefecture of Oita on the island of Kyushu. And Usuki is fairly well known for its carvings of Buddhas, rock carvings. What most people don't know, including people in Japan, is that Usuki is also home to a number of whale graves, which is interesting because this is not an area that is historically known for whaling, and unlike a few other places in Japan that we'll talk about later. But every now and then, whales that would follow the current that takes them this way up along the southeastern coast of Kyushu to the coast of Shikoku would get lost and somehow end up going further north, and in a few places they stranded, possibly beached themselves along villages in Usuki. And what you see here on the picture is one whale grave that dates back to around 1870. And at the time, the local fishing village was struggling economically. They had a significant debt. And the whale that beached in many ways saved this community, or provided them with additional income, because a whale means not just meat that you can consume, but at the time it means significant resources: oil, bones, baleen, other items that this community could sell. And again, this is not a whaling area historically. So people thanked the whale, and in order to commemorate this event, they didn't just build this whale tomb or this whale grave along the coast. They also every year, until today, invite a Buddhist priest to come and to conduct a memorial ritual, or kyo, for the spirit of this particular whale. And the elements from this whale, including bone and part of the baleen, are still kept by local residents in this village. And it's very much part of the story that the community tells about itself, the whale that came to save them. A similar example of a whale that came to save people can be found in the far northeast of Japan. This is the large city of Sendai in Miyagi Prefecture. And if you go further north, you're near the port town of Kisenuma, that some of you may remember from 2011. The tsunami was severely hit. But nearby, there is a small peninsula, the Karakura Peninsula, where there's a shrine called Osaki Shrine. And the story of this shrine is that it was created to venerate a whale god, a white whale that had come to the rescue of the ancestors of this particular village, who had migrated from Kyushu in the south to this Karakura Peninsula, to Tohoku, the northeastern region, in the early 14th century. This was a white whale, and people associated this whale with the popular fishing god Ebisu, who also today is widely worshipped across the Japanese archipelago. There are various other examples of Ebisu associated with whales or with dolphins. So people believing that dolphins or whales are the physical embodiment, one of the manifestations of this Shinto deity, Ebisu. This particular story comes from the early 14th century, but there are various other whale graves from the 19th century around this shrine. And interestingly, until the mid-20th century, the occupation period, when pretty much everybody in Japan was made to eat whale meat as part of the diet at the time that was encouraged by the American occupation authorities, until that time, people in this region would not consume whale meat, because the whale was their god and it was considered taboo to eat that meat. That's not a story about Japanese human-whale relations that you hear very often. Third case that I want to introduce to you is, again, we're going south, but now we're in the far west of Honshu. So this is Kyushu Island. This is the far west of Honshu in the prefecture of Yamaguchi. Now, unlike those other two places that I mentioned, this is actually a area that was known, or that was associated with pre-modern or early modern coastal whaling prior to the 19th century, so in the 17th, 18th century. And what you see here on the picture is a whaling reenactment festival that was created in the early 1990s and has been conducted annually since, with the exception of 2 years during the COVID pandemic. But recently they have reintroduced this, where people dress up like 17th or 18th century whalers, what they supposedly look like, go in these boats, and there's this gigantic whale look-alike that floats on the ocean, that in many ways comes alive during this festival. And then one of the men throws the spear and kills the whale, whereupon red blood gets out of it, and they take the whale to the land. So this is quite a spectacular reenactment of what whaling might have looked like at the time, which is now a celebratory event. But in the 17th, 18th century, whaling was part for this fishing village. It was a seasonal activity, and because the island is quite far out of the mainland. The current that took the whales on their because whales are migratory animals, so the currents that took the whales got them quite close to the land. So boats would go out and would hunt whales. Now, this place was also strong. There were strong Pure Land Buddhist traditions there, and here that came with particular stipulations. First of all, whales who were hunted were given posthumous names and received mortuary tablets, not unlike human ancestors. Those tablets were placed in local Buddhist temples. But there were also certain ethical stipulations about what kinds of whales could be hunted and what kinds were not, and including the idea that pregnant whales could not be hunted. That nevertheless happened occasionally, because it's very hard to see when a whale passes. You can't usually see whether she's pregnant or not, and people would then bury the whale fetuses, and this is here a memorial tomb that has the Chinese characters for Namu Amida Butsu, so hail to the Amitabha Buddha, who's the main deity who provides salvation within Pure Land Buddhism, and people would then pray for the spirits of these whale fetuses. There is a local legend about a particular incarnation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara of Kannon, that people refer to as Gyore Kannon, the fish spirit Kannon, which is a very unusual name. There's another much more common manifestation of Kannon, that's Gyorang Kannon, that's a fish basket Kannon, but here she's called Gyore, and this Kannon would appear in the dreams of people and would tell them not to hunt the whales with the baby calves. Part of the reenactment festival is, in fact, that they get this big whale to the land and they take out a cute stuffed little baby whale and they sing 17th or 18th century whaling songs. 3 cases, and this is, by the way, also a place, those of you who study Japanese literature may be familiar with the work of Kaneko Misuzu, early 20th century poet that recently gained new popularity, and she has a very beautiful poem about the memorial for the spirits of the whales, written from the perspective of the whale calf who has lost its father and mother, who hears the temple bell and cries out of a longing. Just so the sound of the temple bell tells them that their father and mother no longer are alive. And this is you could argue, a very early example, early 20th century example of a sort of more than human or non-human perspective in literature. So I've mentioned it here. Some of you who study Japanese literature may be familiar with her work with this poet. This is the exact location where that poem is placed. So 3 cases, 3 examples, 3 different mnemonic sites that have a story to them, that have a particular memory with them, and 3 very different ways of conceptualizing and enacting human-whale relations. So today I'm going to make 3 main points, 3 ideas I would like to share with you, and that's sort of illustrated by these 3 examples. So the first argument that I'm making today is that human-whale relations in the Japanese archipelago are historically characterized by much more diversity than the paradigmatic standard narrative of Japan is a whaling nation suggests. And this narrative that whaling is an intrinsic part of Japanese culture, of what it means to be Japanese, this narrative has been successfully promoted since 1986. 1986 is the year of the international moratorium on whaling implemented by the International Whaling Commission. And Japan was one of very few countries that did not, as many of you probably know, that continued whaling since that moratorium. And the whaling lobby, together with allied, shall we say, political allies, have since been very active in promoting research on whales, whale science, whaling, and also the narrative of whaling as an integral part of Japanese culture. But these cases of Karakura and Usuki show that human-whale relations were about much more than just going out and killing them. Second argument I'm going to make today is that traditions of whale worship and whale-related rituals are by no means unique to Japan, and that in fact the comparative analysis reveals some very interesting similarities with practices elsewhere that in turn can shed new lights on practices happening in Japan. And my own comparison that we'll talk about a bit more later is between Japan and Vietnam. But similar comparisons could be made with places, other places. And my third point, and this is reflects my general interest in rituals and in how people use rituals and how rituals change in response to things that are happening in a natural environment. So I'm interested in how rituals serve to mediate or to cultivate relationships between humans and various non-human others. And those non-human others include gods, spirits, non-human animals, trees, waves, and so on. Many of these whale rituals continue to be significant today, also, maybe especially so in places where whaling has long been discontinued. And one of my arguments is that you can cultivate whaling heritage. You can, for tourism purposes, for purposes of community revitalization and so on, without actually having to continue practicing whaling for livelihood. These are two different methods. You can have one without the other. Very briefly, a note on terminology. In my title, you may have noticed two words that are concepts that have become quite popular, quite widespread, especially within the environmental humanities, so various humanities subjects that consider topics such as environmental change and how humans respond to crises. The first is the term more than human. That's an equivalent, or another term that often people use is multi-species. I personally prefer more than human because the notion of species doesn't necessarily reflect classification practices of the people that I study, and also because the term more than human to me encompasses not just plants and non-human animals and trees, but also the various deities and spirits that people might relate to, and that in some cases actually take animal or plant bodies. So for me, the term more than human is sort of encompasses both things we might call secular and things we might call religious. The other term that I use that I briefly want to explain is the term Anthropocene, that I assume is a term that many of you will have come across before. This now widely refers to our current geological age. There is some disagreement among scientists and among scholars, different disciplines, whether this term is adequate or not, but it has come to be used quite widely to refer to the complicit crises of especially our age, especially that have come after the Industrial Revolution, including but not limited to climate change, to widespread biodiversity loss, to plastic pollution, and so on. So these are terms that the value of this term lies in the fact that it provides a sort of a common ground for scholars and scientists in different disciplines to discuss these kinds of matters. But let me just point out that so Anthropocene, the notion of anthropos refers to human, but it's key to keep in mind that not all humans are equally responsible for this mess in which we are, some more so than others. But they're still fairly useful terms. So my interest is in Anthropocene, or things that happen in the Anthropocene, and how environmental change, for example, relates to ritual transformations. So very briefly, as Jason mentioned, this research is part of the project Whales of Power that is funded by the European Research Council. And this is actually a group project that involves also research in other parts of East and Southeast Asia, as well as more international politics of whaling. And including, in addition to myself, there has been one postdoc, 3 PhD students, a number of guest researchers and collaborators involved in this project. So my thinking about these subjects, I want to acknowledge that my thinking about these subjects has been also very much influenced by doing this kind of collaborative work with others. And the project has three overarching objectives. We're sort of approaching the end of the project period now. Has had three overarching objectives. The first is to look at ritual transformations in mostly 21st century Asia, so in response to social environmental change. The second is to contribute to a new comparative paradigm in Asian studies. So that's one of the things I'll talk about today. Yes, focus is mostly on things happening in Japan, but the way I think about this is very much influenced also by my research in Vietnam. And the third is to bring together insights from environmental humanities and religious studies. And my own work has been mostly ethnographic work in different, so multi-sited ethnography in different places in Vietnam and Japan, conducted in between 27 and 23, so short periods in between. A few publications I just briefly want to mention, if for those of you who are interested and want to read more, that reflect and tell more about the cases also that I introduced today. There are two journal articles that discuss whale rituals and whale festivals in contemporary Japan. The first one, Whaling on Stage, was published last year in the journal Religion. The second one is forthcoming in the journal Contemporary Japan, where I also make this argument about how whale rituals are not contingent upon the continuation of whaling. If you're interested in whale worship in Vietnam, I recommend a journal that was published last year in Environmental Humanities, When Gods Drown in Plastic. And there is a forthcoming edited volume on sacred aquatic animals, so not only whales, but also dragons and turtles and snakes and other sacred animals in the wider Asia-Pacific region that I have co-edited, Water Powers. And then I'm currently working on a book project, which some of the things we're talking about today will go into that book that's tentatively titled Stranded Gods. So whales have been many different things to humans. I think that's very important to keep in mind. And these humans, some of these are in and have been in Japan. Others are in other parts of the world, including Europe and the United States, and other parts of Asia and so on. Whales have been natural resources. They have been monsters. They have been divine gifts, such as the one that I mentioned in Usuki. They have been maritime deities or messengers themselves, such as the whale in Karakua. They have been reincarnated ancestors. There is a region of Indonesia, eastern Indonesia, called La Malera, where people still engage in certain types of traditional whaling and where they believe that the whales are the spirits of their ancestors. Similar beliefs can be found in some Arctic indigenous communities. Whales have been fishing companions. There are many stories of fishers who did not actually catch the whales, but followed the whales and helped them find fish, and then they together use some of these fish, and there's sort of a collaboration between whales and humans. Whales increasingly, and especially in the late 20th century, have been seen as spiritual guides, people who go swimming with dolphins because it helps them understand themselves, or can even be a kind of therapy. And whales have become environmental icons. They have come to embody our human capacity to save not just whales, but to save the planet as a whole. And this particular understanding of whales became very widespread and popular internationally in the 1970s, 80s. Whales can be national capital. Now they can be global heritage. We have whale heritage sites these days. And that also can turn them into tourist commodities, because whale watching is a much more profitable enterprise than whaling, and so on and so on and so forth. I've been told that when I go to the US and I talk about whales, I must mention Moby Dick. So here it is. But this, of course, is one example of a book where the whale signifies many different things, right? Yes, it's a monster. Yes, there are divine connotations. Yes, it's an icon of American literary culture. Roger Payne in the 1970s recorded the Songs of the Humpback Whale. Was a best-selling record that some scholars argue have contributed significantly to the way humans across the planet have started thinking differently about whales. Suddenly whales became artists even. And whales can be cute mascot characters, such as here in the city of former whaling city of Ulsan in South Korea, and much more. Now, so again, Japan is no exception to this rule. Whales have been many different things in Japanese history and today. There are just a few books that I want to mention that I'm much indebted to. The first of these is a study by Jacobina Arch, environmental historian, Bringing Whales Ashore, which is a study of early modern, so Edo period, 1718 up to mid-19th century, small-scale coastal whaling, including that place that I mentioned, Kaioi in Yamaguchi. Finn Holm is a book that The Gods of the Sea that came out recently that kind of parallels or complements Arch's study in that he writes particularly about Tohoku, so the region where the Karakura Peninsula is located, and he argues that up until the modern times, up until whaling stations were established there in the early 20th century, this was actually an anti-whaling region. So people did not hunt whales. They caught fish, and whales would help them. There's a study, a bit hard to read, Mayumi Ito, The Japanese Culture of Mourning Whales, which is more of an overview of all these different whales and shrines that including some of those that I mentioned today, and a Japanese 9-volume book series, Kujirazuka Kara Miete Kuru Nihonchi no Kokoro, which is seeing the heart of the Japanese from the whale graves. Now, this title is somewhat, I don't know, culturalist, but nevertheless, this series gives a very good background information about various whale shrines and temples and graves and so on. So these are some of the books that I'm influenced by. But again, many, or sort of the overarching narrative in much of the Japanese literature and in some of the English literature is that this has all been variations on the theme of humans going out and hunting whales, that this is a key part of what it means to be Japanese. And I beg to differ. Here are two additional examples of whale graves that are specifically that are not associated with whaling. Some of these are not very well known. This is Hachinoya in the far north of Tohoku, and here is a statue of Ebisu again, that maritime god, but a stone that is believed to be that's also called like the Ebisu stone, that is believed to be the body of a whale, Hachinoya, what was his name? Hachinoya Taro, who migrated annually from Hachinoya in the far north to the shrines of Kumano in the Kansai region. And this belief that whales and dolphins as well actually pilgrims going to Kumano. Kumano belief is quite strong also in coastal regions in the far north. Going to Kumano and coming back, of course, reflects whales' migration patterns, right? And it's quite possible that people would recognize particular individuals. What happened to this whale is that he would come back to the same place, and at some point he was severely wounded, possibly because some whalers in Taiji near Kumano had hit him with a spear. He had then come back to that place in the far north to die and beached himself. So this particular shrine there in the vicinity of Hachinoya has a memory of that particular individual. Hokkaido is also very interesting because Hokkaido, as some of you know, of course, wasn't part of or wasn't included into the Japanese state until the Meiji period, until it was colonized. And then in the late 19th century, settlers from various parts of mainland Japan would migrate and move up to Hokkaido, and especially in the south. And they came with their different understandings of what whales are. Some of them would eat whale meat when there were stranded whales. Others would refuse to do so. And in some cases, they would get the bones of whales and they would enshrine them in local newly built shrines. Including this Inari shrine in southern Hokkaido. So these are just, again, a few examples of people treating whales or the remnants of whales quite differently from what the Japan's whaling narrative suggests. Okay. Moving on to the theme of comparison. The comparative methods have long been a key component of both religious studies and anthropology, and have also been criticized for various reasons. But one of the critiques of comparison is that it can be universalistic, that it can deny difference between different cultures or different traditions and so on. But recently there have been a sort of a reappraisal or a return on the part of various scholars of the importance of comparative research, and not just explicitly, but not just implicitly, but explicitly comparative thinking, using some cases in one place to shed light on things happening elsewhere, to raise new questions. And that should be done in a way that it doesn't reproduce certain essentialist ideas about, for example, East versus West, or about Japanese versus Vietnamese and so on, but rather look at particular practices in, for example, in different parts of East Asia, and understanding that some of the things that we might think, we might read in some of the literature are uniquely Japanese or specific to Japan are in fact much more widespread across Asia, right? So some of the work that I'm influenced by are Peter van der Veer on the value of comparison, and a book that came out a few years ago on statues and on practices of animation in different parts of Asia, including South Korea, Vietnam, Bali, and Myanmar, by Laurel Kendall. And this, especially within East Asia, makes, I think, a lot of sense, and this is also explains my comparison of Japan and Vietnam, both of which are part of the so-called Sinosphere, the so-called East Asian cultural sphere, including strongly influenced by Confucianism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Chinese writing. So my work compares places and practices in Japan and Vietnam, but not so much those countries as a whole. Another thing in relation to this is what Heather Swanson has recently pointed out in a book on salmon in modern Hokkaido, is that scholars are not the only ones who make comparison. The people that we study also are engaged in their own comparisons, and these in turn can be world-making activities, right? So people in one place, some of my interlocutors in Vietnam, the moment I say that I'm also doing research in Japan, they're like, but they're different from us because they eat whale meat and we don't, right? So that's an important comparison. And then I say, true, but some of the rituals are actually quite similar. So, okay, then we're engaging in a sort of comparative dialogue, me and the interlocutors and me. So this is all how we live in our worlds. But what we try to do, or what I try to do in my research, this kind of ways of thinking comparatively, try to make them explicit and try to see also how other people are doing this. So the comparison I would like to share with you briefly today is the Lord of the South Sea in Vietnam. This is a deity that is usually referred to as Kaom, so Lord Fish or Grandfather Fish, or Om Nam Hai, the Lord of the South Sea, the grandfather of the South Sea. And this is a whale, or it usually takes the body of whale. This is a particular worship tradition that is quite widespread in coastal villages, in fishing villages along the coast of South and Central Vietnam, but not in the north. And just as we've seen that in the case of Japan, that certain practices like whaling-related rituals might be found in Kyushu or might be found in some places, and then they're quite different from Tohoku, from the northeast. In the same way, ritual traditions in South and Central Vietnam differ in some crucial respects from traditions in the north, and this is one of them. This was originally a Cham deity, a pre-Vietnamese deity, and we're not going into the whole history of this too much, but it was incorporated into the modern national or early modern nationalist pantheon at the beginning of the 19th century. And what's really interesting here is that part of that foundational mythology of this new dynasty was that the first king, Yalom, was rescued by a whale when he was in a severe storm. And this whale was then identified with the non-Vietnamese, the Cham deity, that also took the body of a whale. So it was a way of incorporating this deity into a national pantheon in a story about a whale saving the founding father of a dynasty. That actually reminds us of what I said in the beginning, this story of Karakura, where also the whale saved the founders of the village on their perilous journey from the south. So today people worship whales, or they take very seriously that whales are life-saving sea gods. And many people can tell you stories, if you ask them, about how they themselves were saved by whales, or very often by dolphins. These stories also make it into national news. They go viral on social media. Stories about how a fishing boat, for example, got in a storm, radars stopped working, and a pod of dolphins appeared and guided them back safely to the land. People also in Vietnam, when a whale beaches itself, and there is a very strong sense of that the whale chooses to do so at a particular place to bestow its blessing upon that particular place, people bury the whale, as you see on that picture. This is just probably a young dolphin. And after conduct funeral rituals, and after several years, usually 3, dig up those bones, and enshrine them in their village temples. And again, we've seen several examples of shrines in Japan where also, and some of these tombs in Japan, where also whales who were stranded or who beached themselves, where people would take the bones and enshrine them, or they constructed graves and tombs and so on. Also, last but not least, want to point out that this notion, and those of you who study Asian religion might recognize the Chinese character for God or deity, that in Japanese is pronounced kami. That's the same kami as the shin in Shinto. And one of the standard narratives about Shinto is that it's an indigenous and uniquely Japanese tradition, which is problematic for various reasons. But also one of the arguments that, or one of the popular statements about Shinto that one comes across quite often in popular literature and online and so on, is that the notion of kami cannot be translated into gods, right? But in fact, this notion of kami, or rather of shun, or tan as it's pronounced in Vietnamese, is a generic pan-East Asian concept that travels quite well, and that can refer to a variety of divine creatures, including spirits of trees, spirits of whales, and so on, or deified humans, or mythological creatures, and so on. So there's a shared ritual logic between Japan and Vietnam, and probably other parts of East Asia, in relation to whales, that whales are seen as sacred helpers or as messengers, and they're very often associated with the Bodhisattva Guanyin, or with Kannon in Japanese. I think we have a picture of her here as well. As many of you probably know, Guanyin, Kannon, is worshipped widely across East Asia, and people believe that she can save those in distress on sea. Living whales are manifestations of a particular maritime deity, and this is a deity that also can bestow blessing and help humans, especially giving them a good catch. And importantly, and this reflects a much wider cultural logic, ritual logic in East Asia, that after they die, whales can become protective ancestral spirits, and they should be treated with proper ritual respect and care. Of course, if you don't do that, if you don't treat them with proper ritual respect and care, it also follows that they can start wandering, they can cause havoc, they can be wandering or angry spirits, right? So the importance of conducting rituals in a way to guide the lived animal body once it dies to become a good spirit is actually something that is not limited to whales. What you see here on the picture is a Guanyin. This is a Guanyin statue from the south of Vietnam, and you see the whale that she has on her hand, indicating that the whale is her helper. And this is a Kannon statue that I saw in somewhere in Kyushu. That is actually quite recent date, around 1990, and we see a Kannon with a dolphin, baby dolphin, and judging from the characters, this was probably then commissioned by a fishing boat to conduct a kuyo, a memorial ritual for the spirits of dolphins that they had killed, whether on purpose or not, I don't know. So finally, the last point I want to make is that many of these rituals still matter today, but they don't necessarily matter in the same way that they did 50 or 100 years ago. So I would like to share a few examples of whale shrines, temples, whales related sites that have acquired new meaning in recent years, and what these kind of meanings can be. And the first of these is a whaling town called Ayukawa in Miyagi. Now, if you remember from the beginning, I gave this example of Karakura, which is also in Miyagi Prefecture, and I said historically this is a non-whaling region. People would not eat whale meat. But Ayukawa is a 20th century whaling port that was established, that was created quite in the same prefecture, and that grew very big in the early post-war period. And again, the early post-war period is the one period that Japan invested heavily, supported by the United States, invested heavily in the whaling industry, and that whale meat became a core element of many people's school lunches and so on. So Ayukawa grew, as a town, grew very significantly in the early post-war period. And then afterwards, as people stopped eating whale meat, as the industry became more and more obsolete, the town started shrinking. Of course, shrinking coastal towns or rural towns is one of the big themes in the study of Japan today. But what happened with this town, so they had like a whale theme park and a museum and local whale meat restaurants, and they had their annual whaling festival that was had been established as a kind of celebration for those who worked in the industry. And that was all in decline until in 2011. This was one of the places that was hit the hardest by the tsunami. So a big part of the town was devastated. And then in the years after the tsunami, the whaling festival became an important part of something that people would conduct annually, even before houses had been rebuilt and before people had relocated to the town. And it became a very important symbol of community resurrection. The whale land, the museum, has been rebuilt. It's really quite impressive now. What they also started doing is the kuyo, so the memorial rituals for the whale spirits, that previously had been conducted on a different day, that now, since the 2016 or 17, have been conducted on the same day in conjunction with the festival. And in this kuyo, the spirits of the whales that have been hunted, the spirits of the whalers who died on sea, throughout the 20th century, and the spirits of the humans, the people who died in the tsunami, are all addressed in one and the same ritual. Right? So it's an example of how a particular ritual practice can change or can acquire new significance in relation to, in this case, natural disaster. The second example that I want to mention is the town of Taiji, which is probably the most famous or infamous whaling town in all of Japan. Became globally known after 2009, the documentary The Cove, which portrayed a practice of dolphin hunts that were really rather cruel. But then that town of Taiji, the portrayal also is fairly one-sided in that documentary. But what happened is that the town of Taiji then became a site where many animal rights activists from other countries would gather and would protest, and in some cases also harass local residents or domestic tourists who would come because they also have an aquarium when you can see dolphin shows and so on. So this is one of the most iconic and also one of the most contested places of whaling in Japan. At the same time, it's a site that or a municipality that in recent years have actively tried to reinvent itself as a tourist destination. And they have established this new narrative in collaboration with this Japan Heritage Project that they refer to as Living with Whales. Kujira to tomo ni ikiru. And there is this itinerary that you can go around the town and you can visit all sorts of historical sites that are associated with early modern whaling practices. Not so much with the modern ones, but with the early modern ones. And one example of this is that every couple of decades, they have to put new bones, because whale bones, when you put them outside, they tend to decay. But there's this one Ebisu shrine that has this whale-shaped torii. That refers to that's mentioned in a novel that probably didn't exist in the Edo period in this shape, but it's now has become an iconic site of Taiji. And this is at a local shrine. There is this was a tiger, because it was the year of the tiger, a tiger and a whale together on this protective emma, indicating that even in the whaling town of Taiji, there's actually a diversity of attitudes towards whales as symbols, but also with living cetaceans that people go swimming with or watch shows at the local aquarium. And the last example that I want to make of a resignification is a whaling reenactment festival that very interestingly goes back to the 18th century. And so it wasn't quite a reenactment before, but it involves quite elaborate, beautiful ships. They're like the floats, and they're the community members that carry the ship, and they sing whaling songs. And then there are these whales made of bamboo and fabric that attack the boat, and it's like a dance of a boat and whale and attacking, and eventually the whale gets killed. And now this is in a former fishing town, but now an industrial suburb of Greater Nagoya, the city of Yokkaichi, that became very famous actually for its air pollution in the 1970s, but that now seeks to reinvent itself as a tourist destination. And this particular festival, Kujirabuna Gyoji, has been listed as UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage together with a number of other float festivals in Japan. And that has created this whole new dynamic. Every year the festival then, is visited by scholars and by tourists and by corporate sponsors and so on. But also whaling industry has shown interest in this festival, despite the fact that this is not historically a whaling location. So there are some questions about why is it that a non-whaling town such as this one developed a whaling festival, and there's some different theories that maybe at some point a whale that swam up the wrong way, or maybe it was a reflection upon practices elsewhere, or copying practices elsewhere. Anyway, but this shows some of the new meanings that can be attributed to these kinds of traditions, and it also shows that these new meanings are not necessarily contingent upon whaling. So a few last points to conclude, which is basically repeating my earlier arguments. First, as I said, human-whale relations in the Japanese archipelago are characterized by significant diversity. They were in the past and they still are today. Whales are many different things to humans. Humans may also be different things to whales, but we don't really know that. But the fact that, but we do know that there is much more diversity than what the whaling narrative suggests. The second point, just to summarize, is that whale graves and rituals are remarkably widespread across the Japanese archipelago, but this is not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. There are similar examples that can be found elsewhere in Asia and also in other parts of the world, where people venerate whales, or where they believe whales to be ancestral spirits, for example, and where they conduct memorial rituals for them. And last, these places and practices, they're not fixed in times. They can be memorial sites. They can serve a mnemonic function in the sense that they help people remember things that happened in the past, but they also change, and the meanings that are attributed to them, that people, both local people, but also other actors, scholars, journalists, tourists, local authorities, whaling lobby, companies, and so on, the meanings that those actors attribute to these practices are subject to change, and the relevance of these practices is not necessarily contingent upon the continuation of whaling. So that was my talk. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
Here.
Have a seat.
So, thanks everyone, and thank you, Professor Rhodes. I just want to acknowledge the first 40 minutes of sonic, the hostile environment that you're a very good sport, as everyone was, to endure that. Apparently, there was a permitted sound check for some event that either is today or tomorrow that we didn't know about. So again, apologies for that.
That's okay.
So at this point, I would like to open up the Q&A session. Again, if those of you who are joining via Zoom, if you have a question, please do not use the chat bar. Please go down to the bottom of the frame. You'll see the Q&A button, and you can submit your question there. I have some that are already sort of accumulating, but I would like to ask the live audience if they would, if there's anyone who would like to begin with a question or a comment for Professor Rhodes. And Kira from the Shinzo Ito Center has a microphone. She'd be happy to hand you if you would like to speak. Lisa, it's opening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. Ross. It was really fascinating. I have a question about canon.
Yeah.
And canon being the protector of the whale fetuses.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you have conducted any research on the connection between this particular manifestation of canon and canon's other, mother and child protective functions in not only in Japan but in other parts of Asia.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question, and this is it's something I've been meaning to look into. So in several of both the towns that I mentioned and some of the other towns, it's very common to see statues of Gyorang Kannon, of the fish basket Kannon, and you see her in fishing towns, and so she's sort of this protective maritime incarnation, right? And so this Gyore Kannon that they have in Kaioi, I think it's a sort of local variation on that theme, but I haven't really been able to find, I haven't found any research on this. So this is something I hope to look into more and to see if maybe it's just a local legend, or if there are other similar similar ideas about, but yeah, it's a kind of an odd, it's like the day like spirit instead of basket. But the Gyoran, the fish basket canon, really is quite widespread. And another manifestation of canon of Guanyin that I'm interested in and would like to look into more is the Guanyin of the South Sea. So Nanhai. Or Nankai, but I think, she's not so very widespread in Japan. I think this is more in China and in Vietnam. So the association between Kannon and also potentially with other maritime goddesses and whales and fish and so on, it's definitely a topic that I hope to study more in the future. Thank you.
So let me ask the first one from the Zoomosphere.
Yeah.
And this is from Ding Ding Wong. Dear Professor Rhodes, thank you so much for sharing wonderful research on rituals of whaling in Japan. I wonder if you're aware of any intersection between the Christian belief or ritualistic practices and whaling in West Japan, particularly in some conventional whaling communities in Nagasaki, like the Hirado Islands?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So in the Goto Islands also, So Hirado and Nagasaki, there were some places where in the Edo period the whaling was conducted, but also in the Goto Islands in what is now known as Shinkami Goto in the I think it's called Arikawa, the village there. There is so that's in the far northern point of the Goto Islands. There is a whaling museum. Next to that, there is a shrine to a that I think is dedicated to the Dragon King that has a whalebone tori, and there's a local Benzaiten festival that also has various associations with whaling. Benzaiten being another watery goddess, aquatic goddess. Now that same island, a bit further, there is a Catholic church that this is not actually Kakure Krishan, it's very early Meiji. But to what extent the people who conducted the festival, the Benzaiten festival, and the whaling practices there, to what extent these people were also Christians? That's a good question, and that's something I'm not entirely sure. But I would suspect that among the whalers there were definitely also Christians or hidden Christians because that was their livelihood practice, and I don't think there was anything in their particular type of Christianity that prevented them from engaging in whaling, as far as I know.
Okay, thank you. David?
Again, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering if you had any like historical context. So across these different villages, they
Yeah.
have like the same notions of like Buddhism religion.
Yeah.
But did they like independently all come to the conclusion that like whales kind of should be this like holy or like respected like form? Like,
Yeah.
so-
Yeah, so I mean, there are these examples like in the case of Karakura, where people like move from Kyushu up to Tohoku, right? And they're possibly one of the reasons for that many Kumano shrines and Inari shrines you could find in Tohoku and also in southern Hokkaido also have to do with kind of migration. And definitely in modern times, like the whaling town of Ayukawa, the first whalers that came there, they came from places like Taiji because they had the whaling expertise, even though were going through this transition from earlier whaling techniques to modern industrial whaling techniques. So there have always been these kinds of connections. At the same time, you can do it. It is observable that there are actually quite different practices and beliefs in different parts of the country. And so, yeah, maybe can think of that as a sort of wider family resemblance of, and that's why I use the term like ritual logic that extends beyond Japan as well. That there's certain ideas, certain practices that travel, and at the same time they take their local shapes that can be quite different. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. These were not completely isolated villages that had no sense of what was going on in other places. And Jacobina Arch also has shown in her book how in the Edo period, how those whaling practices, even though there were relatively what we might now call peripheral or relatively remote places, and it wasn't very widespread across the country, but whaling as a practice really was very significant for the wider Edo period economy, and we're closely connected in networks with also the capital cities through their use of whale oil and they used it to make pesticides and so on. So yes, there were definitely connections there.
Let me take another one from the Zoom audience. This is from Wei Feng Wen. Apologies if I pronounce your name incorrectly, but here's the question. How do the comparative studies of human-whale relations between Japan and Vietnam reveal different ideas of what a whale is and different orders of human, non-human hierarchy? Can these ideas contest each other? And if so, how much of such contestation is interwoven with religious beliefs? For example, the Buddha goddess, I assume this is a reference to Kannon. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. That's a big question. Let me see where to start. So I think, first of all, it's important to point out that within Vietnam, even though this practice of venerating whales is very widespread along the central and southern coast, the moment you get away from fishing villages, so the moment you go to, I don't know, market towns or more inland, and you talk with people about whales, they're like, we have nothing to do with that, right? So in that sense, it's a particular kind of practice that's associated with the livelihood, or historically at least, have been associated with the livelihood of fishing, and that people who engage in other kinds of livelihoods, such as agriculture or trade, would not worship those same deities. And you see that today when some of these former fishing towns become part of big urban metropolises like the city of Da Nang in central Vietnam. You see that you have a whale temple, and some of the people who are either still fishing or the descendants of fishers, they conduct a whale ritual there. But then next door you have a big new hotels and restaurants, and people who run those places, they come from Hanoi, from the capital city, and they have no idea what's going on in that local temple, right? So there is also within Vietnam, there is that diversity of attitudes or ideas that people might have about whales, in the same way that also historically in Japan people may have had. And so can you, there was a question about hierarchies, right? Yeah, there can of course be contestations in that as well, because you can have conflicting classification models, right? So when you have, and I think that has happened also with like the whole anti-whaling movement that came up in the late or in the 1960s, 70s, and so on. That's a particular way of classifying whales as environmental icons and as highly intelligent spiritual creatures that need to be protected, and that maybe grouped different. Aine Kallan, who's a scholar of whaling, he called this a super whale. So people would group different types of qualities that actually belong to different species, would group them together into this one iconic idea of what a whale is, and then suddenly became immoral, or was perceived by many people that whaling was an immoral act, whereas just a generation before, it had been what was considered a perfectly normal thing to do. So those things, they change, and when those ideas travel, then you can have clashes, you can have contestations. The idea that to someone a whale might just be an ordinary resource, and to somebody else that whale is some sort of enlightened spiritual being. Then you have a conflict, right? And I think this partly explains why the continuation of whaling in a country like Japan, but also in countries like Norway and Iceland, has been so contested within international politics, because there are conflicting classification models and conflicting ideas about what whales is and what they can be. And those things are not fixed, they're not static, they're subject to change.
I was wondering, like, you mentioned that some of the whales get like named and like have the rituals in certain shrines. I was wondering, like, is it a certain like relationship that the whale like had to have to be given the names? Like, if they were like the one that saved like a village, like if they were beached,
Yeah.
versus like all the other whales that have been like hunted during the whaling. Is it like a certain relationship that they need to have with the villages to be able to get like venerated to a different status?
I think it differs from village to village. So the practice of conducting these, what they call kyoto, these memorial stupas, or these kind of steles for spirits of hunted whales, and then or of beach whales. So this is not only for hunted whales, and then conducting kuyo mostly by Buddhist priests, but again there are also a few. The one that I showed with the kannon, with the dolphin, this was actually at the Shinto shrine. So it's not always like very clear cut, what is Buddhist, what is Shinto, especially in early modern times. And it wasn't clear cut at the time anyway, right? So these kinds of, the practice of conducting kuyo for the spirits of whales, I think was and continues to be very widespread across the archipelago. But things such as actually giving them these posthumous or these post-mortem Buddhist names and giving them Ihai memorial tablets, That I think is the way they did that in Kayoi. As far as I know, is quite special. That's something that there might have been some other places, but and they included them in the death register and so on. So I think in that place they went quite far in treating dead whales differently from other dead animals, such as fish um, but again, so that's that. I don't want to say like wasn't standardized in any way. Right? So even within Pure Land Buddhism, one temple in one village might do it that way, and then another temple in another village somewhere else in the country might do it a different way.
Here's a question from Epson Knutson. In the Akishima Public Library west of Tokyo, there is a hoisted whale skeleton just inside the entrance.
Okay.
I was wondering what the reason for that might be, or is it a reference to some kind of coming?
What did they do with the whale skeleton? Sorry.
Yeah, so it's I guess it's hanging
Yeah.
as an entire skeleton, not just a couple bones, but the entire thing is how
Yeah.
I'm reading this. At the entrance to the public library.
Okay. If it's just a whale skeleton, then they're probably not deifying it. And whale skeletons in Japan are they're ubiquitous. You can like you go to a maritime museum. I always go to local small maritime museums. It's one of my hobbies because they tend to have so many fascinating items. And if you go to maritime museums in Japan, but also like natural history museums, but in some cases other public buildings, you might see some whale bones, and you might see, I'm not familiar with this particular library. Most of the time, these just have a decorative purpose. But occasionally it might happen that even skeletons and bones that are placed somewhere because they have a decorative purpose are treated differently by people. And I've seen one example of a maritime museum that's also in Tohoku, that's in Iwate Prefecture in Yamada, where they had this is kind of a funny anecdote to tell, a very large sperm whale penis. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that in a natural history museum. They're several meters high. They're quite impressive things. And they put it there, and sort of tongue-in-cheek, with a little sign, something about the whale's power, Kujira no chikaras, or something like this, and a virility. And they put a little tori, like a little shrine gate in front of this. And I assume these are just people like museum curators doing this, right? I don't think there have been like a shrine priest involved in saying, I'm gonna properly conduct a ritual to turn this into a shrine. But then there's a little donation box, and then see people paying coins and just saying a little prayer. There's an element of playfulness to these ad hoc expressions of religiosity is a vague term, but these ad hoc rituals or meanings that people attribute to those kinds of things, that they might not take it very seriously, but that doesn't mean they don't just do the little ritual. And who knows, maybe that's how deification or how many rituals start to begin with. We don't really know how gods begin their careers as powerful gods, and maybe it is through these kinds of either ritual practices of pacification, but maybe more often than we think through very kind of playful rituals. Jolyon Thomas has used this term shukyo asobi, playful religion, to refer to also some of the places where popular culture and religion meet, also in present-day Japan, that people would go to shrines that are associated with popular anime or so, and they call it Seichi Junrei, right? The pilgrimage to sacred places, and these sacred places are those shrines that play a role in those anime, that then becomes an important source of income for the shrines in question and their surrounding communities often, that then generate new festivals and generate new rituals and so on. And who are we to say that this is not, somewhat less authentic? So I think there's this element of playfulness to it that I'm sorry, I realized the question was just about the meaning of the skeleton, and I would said that skeleton maybe have no other meaning rather than decoration, but there are a few cases that where a bone or a skeleton might take on a life of its own, so to speak.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Given that you're situated in Norway, I was wondering if you've done any comparative work looking at North Atlantic whaling practices and rituals compared to those in Asia, and if so, is there any overlap between them?
Yeah, not so much. What I've read and what I've heard is that it's, at least today, it's not particularly ritualized. I don't know if that's true. But I've sort of evaded, to be perfectly honest, I've sort of evaded the comparison with Norway. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't want my project to be about whaling. Like, I can't escape it. Keeps on, when you talk about whales and you talk about Japan, you can't really escape whaling. But I'm really more interested in the various ritual practices surrounding human-whale relations in their different shapes. So I haven't done research in Norway itself, but of course I sometimes talk about this with colleagues who have, and who asked me the same question. And so maybe at some point I will have to look into this more so I can finally answer that question better. So sorry for that. Thank you. Yeah.
Here's one from Nicholas Mashka. Thank you for the lecture, Professor. Your lecture was very interesting for me, a Japanese philology student from Ukraine, where we love Zoom. Welcome, Nicholas. And here is the question that interests me. Let's see. In distinction of whales, you mentioned that dolphins in your lecture, dolphins porpoises.
Yeah.
What cultural significance do they have? And do they have a lesser or larger cultural role than whales?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you very much. So first of all, biologically, I forgot to mention this, but biologically, dolphins are whales, right? So there are two groups of whales. There are the baleen whales. There are those, that have these beards, right? And then there are the toothed whales. And the toothed whales, so the ones that with teeth, include sperm whales, orcas, dolphins, porpoises, pilot whales, right? So the group of toothed whales that includes both, like the giant sperm whale, Moby Dick, the orcas, and the dolphins. These are all like members of the same family, biologically speaking. In East Asia, like the Chinese character for whale and the character for dolphin, they're different. So there is some kind of distinction. But I've also found like in that distinction, people may or may not make that distinction explicitly. And in Vietnam especially, both dolphins and whales would be associated with the same kaom, this Lord Fish. So they're both dolphins and whales are creatures that can save humans. And also, like in Tohoku in Japan, both dolphins and whales would, or maybe in other places as well, have been associated historically with ebisu and considered to be pilgrims. But there's one important difference, I think, and that is that the moratorium on whaling and all the global debates about whaling since 1986, well, before, but since the moratorium in 1986 has been more visible, and the contestations over Japan's continuation of whaling in the 1990s and early 2000s, by and large, focused on large cetaceans. And the species that is the most hunted, also because the populations are fairly robust, is the minke whale. Now, minke whales are one of the smallest of the baleen whales, so they're not as big as blue or fin whales. Anyway, so much of the contestation was about these minke whales, but about baleen whales, and in some cases, some other baleen species. Dolphins continue to be hunted by many communities across the planet, and they don't really receive much attention, not even from organizations like Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd and so on. They have for a long time mostly focused on the more shall we say, the more iconic pictures or the more iconic industrial whaling that Japanese ships conducted in the Antarctic, for example. This changed in the early 21st century with the documentary The Cove that I mentioned, that suddenly put the issue of dolphin hunts, which again do not fall under the moratorium. So IWC it has not banned that kind of thing. Dolphin hunts, and also similar dolphin hunts are taking place in far, how do you say that in English? The these islands in between Iceland and Denmark. Faroe Islands, thank you very much. Sorry, Faroe Islands. There is similar practice also of dolphin hunts. And so animal rights activists have, both in the case of Japan, but in the case of these Faroe Islands, have highlighted and mediatized, drawn attention to these kinds of practices. And then there are some other issues involved in that as well. It's not only about animal welfare and animal suffering. It's also about mercury pollution and about public health. That sometimes the meat of these animals is at very high levels of mercury that can cause health problems. So anyway, so that was kind of off the radar, and it has become a little bit more debated in the 2010s. What's happening now is that what I think is that, in fact, whaling is becoming less politicized and less contested internationally, because also marine conservation specialists, animal rights activists realize that whaling is not the biggest threat to whale species. Some whale species have rebounded, are doing fairly well, but even those populations that are still struggling, they have much bigger concerns, which is sound pollution, which is plastic pollution, which is they get into nets, which is military exercises, like the kind of military exercises in the ocean that are conducted by global powers. They make many non-human casualties. That taken together, all these different problems are much more of a concern for the well-being of whales than a few countries in the world and some indigenous populations continuing hunting practices. So anyway, long story short, whales and dolphins, yes, there's a lot of overlap in classification, in the kind of meanings attributed to them, but there are also some and have been some differences in the way that people have thought about them.
Very good. Thank you. From the audience?
Thank you.
Anyone here?
Can I ask, does anybody else have a question? Okay, can I ask another question?
Go ahead.
So one of the things I'm wondering about, I've come across in some Zen monastic codes, kuyo for like animals and creatures, like little tiny insects and animals who are believed to be suffering in the animal realm in the Buddhist cosmology. And because of that particular reincarnation, they cannot generate merit for themselves. So others have to do things like say prayers, or I've come across other records of nembutsu for the little crabs and all kinds of little tiny creatures. So I'm wondering, is there a difference in your view between these kind of kuyo for whales? Are they seen as different from other animals for whom there's kind of like been established since, I mean, the one monastic code I'm thinking of is 1324, Keizan Shingi by Keizan Joki. So that goes way, way, way back, this idea of performing some kind of a kuyo for animals. But are these ones that you are studying, are they different to this kind of group of animal kuyo?
Yeah. Yes and no. And I think it actually, okay, maybe that's kind of a lame answer, but I think, are they seen as different? I think it probably depends on who you would ask. I haven't really looked into the Buddhist doctrinal aspects of this, but you're absolutely right in pointing out that kuyo are conducted for all sorts of animals, right? And they are conducted also for for eggs and for knives and for dolls and for what we might call consider inanimate items, or at least neither animals nor plants. So conducting rituals, and whether it's about pacification, or as some people would say, it's about an expression of gratitude or respect, or some would say, no, it's about guiding them from the one realm to the other, or maybe it's a bit of all of these things. And for many participants, it may just have been you can attend the ritual because it's the time of the year to attend the ritual, and that's what all your bodies do, right? And so for the whaling guilds, financing these kinds of rituals, of course, was a way to share also some of their wealth with the community. So they're all they're the spiritual reasons, they're the Buddhological reasons, then they're the actual fear that people may have had, or for repercussions, and then there are the more kind of more mundane or social, economic reasons, and so on, and they can have taken place at the same time. I personally think some of these places that I've been and some of these whale graves that I've seen, and the way that when you see whale bones that have been placed into shrines, old drawings of whaling, some of the stories that are told locally. The poem is late, is early 20th century, but it reflects a particular way of thinking about this. My inclination is that there are certain kinds of, or certain ways that people would think about whales that were, in some places at least, different from the ways that they thought about catching oysters or squid. I think, but I don't want to generalize too much or essentialize or anything, but I think there's a case to be made for saying that the importance of the rituals for whales, in some ways, outweighs, or that it outweighs, or that it has different connotations than some of the kuyo that are conducted for other seafood or other animals.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
this is speculative. I admit, yeah.
I never heard of other creatures receiving a posthumous Buddhist name, or an ihai, a mortuary tablet.
No.
And then also the
Maybe
way they
horses
do
in
this.
modern times.
Yeah.
Some horses,
Oh,
maybe.
right,
Yeah.
right.
But it's rare. Oh no, until we get into the 20th century and people start doing these things for their pets, right? The
Oh,
pettokuyo.
right.
Then that becomes again a more of a standardized practice where you do it for individuals. But what I find, so that's also an interesting thing, that some of these kuyo are like collective kuyos for whales, but other, like the shrine that I mentioned in Hachinoya, that's really one particular individual that's enshrined there, right? So again, there's this diversity of conceptualizations and of corresponding practices that, I'm only barely scratching the surface there, but also many of these, in many cases, like, there's not so much left. So there's a story that has been written down in a source, and then there's the local place. And other than that, it's just a bit speculation how people may have felt about these things.
Thank you.
So we've got one more question on Zoom. Students, I know some of you might have 2 p.m. obligations, so if you're pressed, if you need to get somewhere, it's okay. We're going to do this last question. If you can hang for just a few more minutes, that's great too. This is from Jason Danley. Apologies again if I have mispronounced your name. I'm really interested in the notions of living together with whales. Do you see this as an effort to merge religious traditions with modern conservation discourse, a kind of enchantment of science, if you will?
Yeah, the way that the term, but that notion of living with whales, I've seen it used in different contexts, but the reference, and I don't quite remember where were the other places where I came across it. I'm not sure Taiji were the Wakayama authorities were the first. I don't think they were the first to use it, but they used that term, became a very key part of the identification and the promotion of certain both temples and shrines, but also like lighthouses and outposts and to places that historically associated with whaling in Taiji and the wider Kumano region, actually. That they use the the trope of the living together with whales, which of course is a bit euphemistic in some ways. So I don't think in that particular case, I don't think I wouldn't call it a re-enchantment, but it's a nice, I would call it a euphemism because it wasn't so much, yeah, it was the humans who were living with whales perhaps, but it was, in many cases, whales were dying with humans. And also sometimes humans were dying during the practice of whaling. It was also dangerous practice, let's not forget. So living and dying with whales would probably have been a more apt name for that. But maybe it doesn't, that's not as good
Another ring to it.
from branding purposes, right? Yeah.
Okay, so it's just about 2:00. I want to thank everyone, but foremost Professor Rhodes for sharing his research with us. Please stay in touch with the Ito Center. We will be doing at least one event a year with the Environmental Humanities speaker series. And again, apologies for that first half hour of noisiness, but we got through.
Yes.
And I thank you very much for coming today, and thank you out and around the world for coming in Zoom. All right,
Thank you.
let's give a couple of things.
Thank you.